And we are live on our episode 25 of our Spirit Reflections Around the Fire conversation series. And I'm super glad to have my dear friend here with us, Tom Cratsley, healer and teacher. Hey, Tom, good evening.
Good evening to you. It's wonderful to be here with you.
It's wonderful to be here too. Receive a big hug from Manhattan all the way to upstate New York.
Right.
To your loved ones. And for those of you guys that are going to be joining us tonight, we're going to be talking about spiritualism in America, especially the history through the 19th century over the 20th century. Tom's going to share a little bit about his knowledge and insights, the work that he's been doing for many years. And we're going to talk about a very important figure in the history of spiritualism in America, which is Andrew Jackson Davis. And Tom has just a wealth of knowledge on that, and including counseling and meditation work, which you're going to learn about. He's given us a few gifts last time we were in Lilydale of your guided meditations on Mother Earth and grounding, which have been so healing for us. We've done it in groups in our center here. We've done it individually, so I want to thank you for that. They're really inspiring.
Well, I'm happy that they work for you, because the funny thing is, when I'm inspired to do these meditations, and I have a dear friend who does the music accompaniment for them, and he's a very inspired man too. But I feel like I can listen to them, and it doesn't even seem like myself doing them. Yeah, which is nice.
You really enter into an altered state, and just is very soothing, right? So for those that are starting to join us, friends, if you have any questions or comments, please type it in, and we'll make sure to get them for you. And so that we can start officially here, I'm going to put our opening vignette, and then we'll go officially introduce. All right. So, welcome everybody. Hi, Kirsten from Maryland. Kirsten Santos, welcome. So, I'm going to briefly read your bio, Tom. So, for those that don't know you, Tom has worked in the fields of counseling, spiritual healing, and teaching for over 30 years, and is the creator and developer of the Restructuring method of accessing, releasing, and transforming unconscious resistance patterns. He's also an ordained minister with the Fellowship of the Spirit, and for the last several years he has served as associate director of their School of Healing and Prophecy. And then while at Harvard Divinity School, Tom was inspired to direct his attention to matters of the human heart and the possibilities of growth and transformation through development of the spiritual dimensions of the heart. Since then, he has created numerous classes and workshops to support others in exploring the vast dimensions and extraordinary healing potentials of the heart. And we've had, like we were saying before, the chance to be with you a couple of times in person up in Lilydale, and it's been really a rewarding weekend, Tom. So why don't you start us off by telling us about your background? How did you first awaken to these spiritual tools? How did you get there? Take us back.
It's an interesting question, because I think, I grew up in a working class family in Buffalo, New York, and I can't remember a time when I didn't have a sense of the numinous, like a sense of being present with something beyond myself. And that is outside of my religious background. And I went to different churches wherever we happened to live at the time, because we moved from Buffalo out to rural Attica, New York. And the churches were either Baptist or Presbyterian. And I remember being inspired by the words of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, but not by the doctrines of the church. Okay, necessarily, right? In fact, I can even remember having a particular bad reaction to communion.
Really?
Oh yes, yes. When they're talking about the blood of Jesus, it's like, why would I want to eat the flesh and drink the blood of the best person who ever lived? I'm a cannibal now. I mean, it's like
Right.
that's exactly what that was my reaction to it as a kid.
Cannibalism.
Yeah, exactly. Transubstantiation had no value to me at that point in my life. So it's like, so I remember having a deep reaction to that. But at the same time, just continuing to pursue, particularly when I was in high school, I was very much interested in secret societies,
Cool.
and yes, and studying some of the Masonic teachings and Order of the Golden Dawn, of those kinds of things, as well as the Edgar Cayce material,
Right.
which was back in the I'm dating myself, but this was back in the '60s when I was in school, in high school, exploring these things, and we happened to have a theosophical library in Buffalo
Oh,
that
wow.
that I would go and spend time with, to go through their material. So I was lucky enough to have those influences as a young person, and in college, there was a metaphysical coffee clutch, and the subject of Lilydale came up this at the University of Buffalo. And so we just thought this has got to be a road trip. So we went up there, a group of people went out, came to Lilydale. This was back in 1968. This would have
So
been.
you were in college at the time.
I was in college at the time, freshman going into the sophomore year.
Okay.
And so I was really smitten by the Healing Temple. That was,
Yeah.
that really got to me, the power of that. And I think if there's one theme that has followed me through my life, it's the concept of grace.
Wow.
And yeah, and just knowing that is a universal constant, and that somehow, in fact, in divinity school, an assignment I was given was to come up with my own, and the whole class was given this assignment, to explore your own definition for some, ecclesiastical words. One of them
okay.
was grace, and then love and various things. And what I came up with for grace for me was the power of love that renders all mistakes temporary.
Wow. The power of love that renders all mistakes temporary.
Yeah.
Wow.
And for me, that fits in a lot with the Andrew Jackson Davis, teachings and so on. But that didn't come for me until sometime in the mid '70s when I had more time to spend at Lilydale. So throughout the '70s and '80s, I was so impressed, as I told you, by the Healing Temple, that I would spend my summers here just to work the Healing Temple. And as a young man, it was a great learning experience, because I had a chance of serving the temple twice a day, every day throughout the summer. And during those days, I was very committed to doing that, and it was a powerful learning experience for me.
Wow.
Yeah, and development, really.
I personally experienced, Tom, this Healing Temple. For those of you friends that have not been to Lilydale in upstate New York, is a fantastic place to visit. Specifically, this Healing Temple, I remember weeping and crying. The power of the healing energy there is so palpable, and the receiving of the laying on of hands, which for spiritists that are watching, we call it the passes. And you guys have, I think, a similar word, but what I was observing and what I experienced was something very similar. But the silence in the place, the grace of the people volunteering their time and doing that in such a heartfelt manner, it was unforgettable. It really was unforgettable. I was crying a lot. It was very helpful.
And something similar happened to me in my first time there, which kept bringing me back there. So that was. That perfectly, expresses again what the very experience that I had when I first went there. So they drew me back, and so simultaneously, as I was going through college, I worked my way through at working in a psychiatric hospital. So I was constantly curious about the workings of the mind, and I saw firsthand how inept some of the practices were in
Right.
psychology and psychiatry. And I knew fundamentally that there was a spiritual dimension that was completely ignored, and it was bothersome to me because even though I wasn't religious at all,
Right.
I knew that fundamentally there's an important spiritual dimension to everybody,
Right.
and that was and if you don't handle that, you don't get the complete person, and you don't get to support them in the best possible way. So that's that was part of my what led me to eventually go to divinity schools, and looking at psychology and religion. But fundamentally, I mean, I was only there for a year, and I realized that wasn't really quite my direction. And as you mentioned earlier, I don't know if it got on here, but it was there that I had connected to the heart.
Right.
And I was given, a download, as we sometimes get. It's like at the time I was working doing metaphysical teachings with an organization in Boston, and the download was, this is not your work. Your work is about the heart. And I was having a great time doing the work that I was doing. So I was thinking, how can this be? But when those things happen to you, you got to listen to them, and you got to
Right.
start pursuing. So then I began to pursue that more fully, and eventually it did become the centerpiece of everything I did with healing and teaching healing practices and so on. And it still is to this day.
Is that what the restructuring technique came in, Tom, when you shifted to the heart?
No, that actually was there was something that was there. It was going on simultaneously. It was another learning. I kept asking myself the question with the restructuring. I kept asking myself the question: how do we get fundamental change? And one of the things I understood, and I believed very, very deeply, that psychiatry did not teach, and psychology in those days definitely did not teach, was transformation. Back then, all they said was the best that anybody could hope for was coping strategies, and
Right.
the ability to cope with your misery.
Right.
And for me, that was just so weak and so sad in many respects. We're. And so I had personally experienced transformation in my life, and I think most people at different times have the opportunity to experience transformation when you
Totally.
something that was negative for you is totally left behind, and you move on. So that became a process for me to explore that process and how to support people in getting there. And so in that analysis, I kept looking at it. I kept looking at the various different methodologies and therapies that were out there at helping people.
Yeah, and in fact, we recently had Emma Bragdon, who I admire her work, and she talks a lot about spiritual awakening, mental health, and she knows a lot about spiritism and mediumship, and she's been to a lot of psychiatric hospitals in Brazil, and she brings many North American psychologists, psychiatrists to observe the work that they do down there, which brings the regular medicine, regular scientists, but as well as volunteer mediums who can tap into the many layers of the patient, not just the brain, but the spiritual dimension. So it's a really interesting thing that we saw. We had a great chat with her here.
That's wonderful. And my understanding, and from things that I've read and heard, is that Brazilian psychiatry has far more success with cases of psychosis and all of that than any other place. So obviously it's working, and they're doing something that works. So I think it's great.
Yep.
So as I kept pursuing this, I came across the work of Roberto Assagioli. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he was a contemporary of Carl Jung.
Okay.
And yeah, and Assagioli did a very simple and similar model of consciousness: self-conscious, subconscious, and superconscious. But the thing that he said and taught that was so profound for me was the way to the superconscious is through the subconscious. In other words, it's not possible to bypass your garbage to get to the heights.
Right, right. Yes. It's what I read about Carl Jung, that in order for the tree to reach the heaven, the roots need to go deep into hell.
Yeah. And so I did not like that, but I knew the truth of it. I thought, boy, I wish that weren't true, but I knew in my heart that it was accurate, it was right. And so his methodologies were interesting. They used metaphorical tools to kind of try to guide people into some of their negativity, and other metaphorical tools to kind of dance around it and work with it. But and I found some of it helpful, but I didn't. There were lots of times when it didn't feel like it was getting to the root of things.
Okay.
And so what got me to that place was witnessing a chiropractor and his wife in it was a combination of that and the writings of Andrew Jackson Davis, which we can get later, right?
Right.
And then witnessing this chiropractor and his wife at a workshop that they led, and I was an attendee at the workshop, and it was called Releasing, and a releasing workshop. So what they did was they were very intuitive, and they could look at you if you had a question. They'd look at you, and I'd say, well, I'm having trouble with my right shoulder. Then they'd look at me and say, well, release hate for your mother in ancient Afghanistan.
Just like that.
Just like that. And I would say that, and I could feel like a temporary relief in that part of my body.
Wow.
That was interesting. And through the course of the weekend, there were 3 or 4 other times that they had the opportunity to do that with me. And the one time that I felt really deep kind of resolution was when they were talking about something that occurred with my father. And I had very clear memory of that on many levels. So conscious memory. And so that I was making those decisions, they had far more power, as I was letting go of the things, the suggestions they were giving to me.
And it was reflecting on your body somewhere that they were working on.
Well, it wasn't always that, but there were different issues. But whatever it was was pointing to whatever my dilemma was. And so I found that those things really stuck. And then I felt like, okay, this is something I can really play with. And so what I decided to play with was this: to get to the source of people's misery. In my counseling strategy, what I do is I get them more present with their misery, and then I regress them from their current level of misery to the source of that in their history, in their soul's history, which is very quick. It's not like I don't get people to relax to get there. I get them being more miserable to get there. And so their misery takes them to the truth of their misery. And while they're present with it, I give them a whole series of choices and decisions to change the way they're relating to that in their consciousness. Most of them are like releasing the hate that's carried there, the fear, the anger, the decisions, and the physiological response to the trauma. And what's interesting is if that's carefully identified, people they can put words around it. They instantly feel it when they let it go. It's amazing. And by the time the session is finished, they feel totally peaceful, totally comfortable in the midst of the core trauma, which is the source of their repeating, energy in this life. They feel totally peaceful, totally comfortable with the sense they've taken back their power, and they have whole new sets of options in relationship to the issue.
Nice.
So that's essentially how that process works.
Kirsten says, wow, that's fascinating, Tom. There's also a therapeutic technique called EMDR, and some therapists use this with past lives as well.
I understand that, and I know that can be helpful. I think the practitioner has to be very skillful
Right.
in that work, because I've seen a lot of it done where there's some temporary relief, but it doesn't necessarily get to the depth of the core of the issue, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
for
but
sure.
it does rely a lot on the skill of the practitioner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so tell us, Tom, when you discovered Andrew Jackson Davis in the 1970s, as you were in your search and in the work that you were doing, what attracted you to him? What was it about him that?
Um, oh my, there were so many things. First of all, I had also made a study of mystics, you know, and that tradition of the people who had followed their own sort of internal inspiration, and people like, I don't know if you have ever heard of a medieval mystic by the name of Jacob Bem.
Jacob Bem,
And
no?
Jacob Bem, very powerful, very amazing mystic. I studied him for a while, and then when a spiritualist friend of mine had turned me on to Andrew Jackson Davis, I could not believe that I had not heard about him from other spiritualists.
Right.
And unfortunately, there are a lot of spiritualists who don't know much about Davis. They find his writing maybe a little bit too arcane or whatever. Of course, it's that 18th century. They're a little more verbose than we are
Right.
in the 19th century, rather, not the 18th century. A little more verbose than we are. But when I started to read him, I was like, this was an incredible. I loved his work, and then to know his history behind that, you know, the is even more astonishing. Do you want me to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we can
Yeah.
talk a little bit about him. Yep.
Well, first of all, let me talk about the basic thumbprint of his philosophy, and it's called the Harmonial Philosophy, but it came through primarily in the first work, which is called Nature's Divine Revelation, A Message to Mankind. Now, this was published a year before the Fox Sisters in 1847,
Right.
and what it was an entirely new cosmology. And in this cosmology, what he did was he brought together the findings, which were so many and numerous in the 19th century, of science
Right.
with spirituality in a way that had never been done before. You know, and in addition to that, as he describes in Nature's Divine Revelation, scientific principles, he goes beyond what science even knew about at that time,
At the time.
and with many things that were later discovered, you know, like in the 20th century and in the late 20th century.
Right.
For instance, he describes the surfaces of the planets in the solar system, including two that had not been discovered at the writing of his book, Neptune
Yeah.
and Pluto.
Wow.
And a lot of their atmospheres and so on later verified by space probes, 100 years later.
Right.
So a number of very grounded, perceptual stuff that you don't get in. What I loved about him is not airy-fairy in the least.
Right.
Everything
Very
is
down to earth and
down to earth, practical.
and he had this ability to go out of his body, right? Or go to these altered states.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, basically what he taught, a lot of what he tried to teach people was how these states of consciousness were available to everybody. Although he had developed to a high degree his capacity to go into what he called the superior condition,
Right.
or the spiritual state of consciousnness. And the superior condition is one in which he has access to all knowledge. Okay, I mean, think of that. I mean, it's remarkable. But he had demonstrated it so many times in his life, so it wasn't, it absolutely remarkable. So access to all knowledge, and when the first book was published, at that time he had to go into full trance states in order for the information to come through. But shortly after that, and he's only about 21 years of age when
Wow.
this occurs, right? And shortly after that, he has his own kind of I would say, spiritual dark night of the soul, because he was very, very disturbed by the fact that all this stuff was coming through him, but he didn't have any conscious awareness of it. And it was
Oh,
very,
okay.
yeah, very disturbing to him.
Right.
So his guides eventually worked with him to get to the point where it was no longer needed for him to be put into trance state by another person. And he could access and be self-consciously aware. He could access those high states of consciousness and be self-consciously aware of them at the same time.
So he was able to shift from more of an unconscious type of ability to a more conscious.
Right. Which
Okay.
is something Casey only sparingly did.
Right.
Davis did this for the rest of his life.
Wow.
From about age 21 on. Right. So, and the other thing he tried to do was to try to tell people and give them an understanding of the states of mind and consciousness, and to understand how their own mind works, so that they could play with these dimensions. They could, in a sense, integrate their spirituality into the normal realms of consciousness, which
Right.
is really, I think, the real goal.
And Tom, for those that are watching here that have never heard of Andrew Jackson Davis, what would you recommend be a first book about him that they read, that they would start with?
His autobiography is called The Magic Staff, and I would recommend that, because it's an extraordinary, yeah, it's an extraordinary story, and it gives his life story, because he was born into dirt poverty, right, and could not read or write till he was 17, and even
Really?
then, yeah. Even then, he could, like, he could sign his name, but it barely, it was essentially an illiterate man. And his spirit guides told him that if he would learn how to read and write, a great deal would be made available to him, and they assisted him in learning.
So he basically learned how to read and write from spiritual teachers.
Yeah. Yes.
Incredible.
So it was absolutely remarkable. But again, then that was like after age 17. But at that point, he'd become interested in mesmerism, right?
Right. Which was all the rage back then, which was what Kardec was into in France at the same time. Yeah.
It was a healing practice at the time, and primarily, but
Yeah.
it was discovered that there were numbers of people, not a huge amount, but there were some people that, while undergoing this healing treatment with the hand passes, which would take as long as 45 minutes for a treatment, that under
For mesmerism.
they would go into deep trance states. And it was discovered when he was in that trance state that he could do medical clairvoyance. He would diagnose and prescribe with exact medical terminology, prescribe cures, etc. And when that was discovered, he and his operator decided this was too important, that they needed to do this, and that became his job for the next couple of years, like a year and a half.
So he went from an illiterate 17-year-old to
Yes.
doing medicine a few years later.
Yes, well, at the same time, just as soon as the trance started working for him. So that lasted for about a year and a half or so, and on one occasion, he was given the guidance, the channeled guidance, that they were to assemble some people in New York City, some illiterati, some bright, some of the more notable, educated people in the city, assemble some, and a series of lectures were to be delivered. And so I guess it was like maybe twice a week, something like that. He would deliver these trance lectures, which were compiled into the book, Nature's Divine Revelation, A Message to Mankind.
And they were received, channeled right here in New York City.
Right in New York City.
Wow.
Yeah. It all happened in New York City, yeah. Yep. And,
Nature's Divine Revelation.
Yes. Yep. And it was absolutely an extraordinary book, and it received worldwide notice. It traveled the world. Interestingly enough, in his day, he was probably as well known, if not better known, than Casey in the 20th century.
That's something that is on my mind to ask you, Tom. Why do you think that a guy like Edgar Casey became so much more well known, whereas Andrew Jackson Davis, practically very few people know him today? Why do you think that is?
Well, he was kind of thrown out, like, the baby with the bathwater, when spiritualism did come under significant disrepute in the early part of the 20th century. And there were a number of scam artists and people who were not doing the things. I mean, there were a lot of genuine,
Sure.
mediums and so on. But then there were other people who were trying to take advantage of the opportunity to scam people. And
Right.
so there were phony mediums and all that. And so as these people were being exposed, people in general started to go, yeah, maybe this is all it is,
Right.
Unfortunately, that and it happens with everything,
Yeah, it's remarkable because when you look at the 19th century United States, the population, I'd say I read something like almost 20% or more identified as spiritualist or professing a spiritualist faith.
At the turn of the century, 11 million, apparently.
11 million Americans identified as spiritualists. Incredible. And then suddenly you have this precipitous drop in the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Much having to do with with charlatanism and people taking advantage
That's right.
through paid things and yeah.
I have my theories about that too, and I also think that spiritualism, in some regards, has been its own worst enemy. Has not been. If the problem I found with spiritualism is it's way too much focus just on mediumship.
And the phenomenon, right?
And the phenomena, and not enough focus and attention on ethics and morality. That part of the. It's interesting. There's one beautiful verse in the Bible about the fruit of the Spirit, and it's in Galatians, and I think it's Galatians 5:22, 23. Not exactly sure.
Okay.
Reveal. But anyway, what it says is the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things, there are no laws.
Against such
second
things,
verse,
there are no laws.
Isn't that amazing?
Wow.
Yeah. Now, here's the thing, and this is one thing I've observed in my life, is that if you nurture and if you supply the fruits of spirit, then the gifts come along with it. Right?
Right.
And the phenomena becomes genuinely beneficial.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we see in primitive Christianity, the first 300 or so years, when it was not centralized, was not connected to politics or with authority figures or things like that, that the faith of people, the spontaneity of the gatherings were such that these spiritual gifts, these phenomena just happened. They just happened. People didn't necessarily gather in order to produce them. They were just a byproduct of the level of love, grace, communion, and good energies, harmony that they nurtured from one another there, right?
Yeah. It's interesting. I've questioned a lot about what is it that separates these great mystics from the rest of us, right?
Right.
And the one thing that I've come to, examining this throughout the years, is moral courage.
Moral courage.
I think that's the biggest difference between them and the rest of us.
What do you mean by that?
Moral courage is that they, regardless of what is happening around them, they stay true to their inspiration, right? And they're capable of doing this at a degree that most of us can't fathom. There's an example in his early life, in Davis's early life.
Okay.
He tells the story. Now, he's not bragging about this because it's in his autobiography. He's just, these are the things that happened to me growing up.
Sure.
Right? So he's about, I think, 10 to 12 years old at the time. He borrows a neighbor's horse and goes into a nearby town, goes into the general store. he comes out of the general store, and there's this group of young guys who are up to no good, and they see this stranger in town, like they're going to mess with him.
Right.
So they start to taunt him, and the biggest bully of the bunch starts to actually physically shove him, and then he punches him, knocks him to the ground, and starts to pummel him.
Wow.
And Davis says that while he's being hit, he gets the inspiration. He says, "Show no anger," and he's able to kind of contain himself and show no anger, like no non-resistance, right?
Yeah.
Talk about a serious turn the other cheek event. So,
Right.
So anyway, the guy stops hitting him, and so he gets up, he dusts himself off. He says, "It hurt. I cried." He said there were tears. And he goes back home, and shortly thereafter, his family moves closer to that town. He finds himself in the daytime in the same general store, and who's there but the kid that attacked him?
Same guy.
Knocked him to the ground, right? Doesn't even recognize Davis.
Wow.
They start up a conversation and become friends. All right. So later on they're talking with one another, and he ends up confessing to Davis. He says, "I got to tell you about something, and I still feel bad about this." Said that there was this kid who came into town, and I don't know why. It's like for some reason I just beat on him. And Davis says to him, "Don't worry, that was me."
Wow.
That's what I mean by that level of kind of like moral courage and the capacity. And so you see that in every great mystic and masters. Certainly there in Jesus and Lao
Right.
Tzu.
Yeah.
The Buddha.
Or
you name
people
it.
like Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah,
also.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. So, Tom, take us to the work that you do with the restructuring. How does all of that baggage that you have with spirituality play into the psychology and the work you do?
Usually one of the things I do with the spirituality part is when a person, when I feel as though a person has actually worked through the negative energy of the origin trauma, because they all comes from old trauma.
Old trauma.
Yeah.
Right.
When they work through the origin trauma, then I encourage them to connect with their guides and teachers to get deeper understanding of whether or not there's anything more for them to understand and about their transformation, and anything useful for them to continue to think about and do going forward to integrate the changes they've initiated. And that's always a powerful piece of it. But in addition to that, when I work, I work consciously multidimensionally. I'm consciously aware of what I call domains of consciousness.
Right.
Now, in the 19th century, when they were talking about these levels of mysticism, they talked about subtle bodies. So
that the theosophy talks a little bit about that too, I believe, right?
And that was there. But one of the things that I realized back in the 80s was like we're no longer in the Newtonian era. We're in a quantum era.
Right.
And so I came up with this model that addresses that. And so the model is based on what I call domains of consciousness, and every domain of consciousness is an octave of frequency.
An octave of frequency.
Yes.
An octave like the scale, the 7 notes on the scale of music, one octave to another octave. Okay.
Exactly.
Cool.
It's an octave of frequency. So we've got the physical octave, the etheric octave, or what I sometimes call the vital octave.
Right.
And then the emotional, the mental, the spiritual, and for me, unconditional love. As the
that's
highest
above
octave.
it.
Yeah, as the highest octave, and that there is also a creative orientation with this. That I believe that the function of love is to manifest something to embrace.
To manifest something to embrace.
Right. So it's like the creative principle. All right. So love, in its desire to embrace itself, develops purpose in the spiritual domain. That purpose takes on structure in the mental domain, which takes on emphasis in the emotional domain, and becomes crystallized in the etheric and physical. I mean, in the etheric, it takes on kind of vital energy, and it all becomes crystallized in the physical.
So the creative, the word you mean is literally to create,
Yes.
to manifest, right?
And since we're constantly in a state of manifestation,
Right.
yeah, and so recognizing that and knowing that that's there, that how pliable we are as beings, that if we so that when I work, I'm conscious of all that, and how I can support people in making the shift.
And then in these shifts of different octaves, how often do you come across other entities that are actually there connected to the person and the trauma?
It doesn't happen that often, as a matter of fact. One of the things I find is that I do believe that there are a lot of things that look like entities that aren't.
Right.
So that what happens is when we have trauma and we don't know how to reckon with it, we push it away from ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's from our physical awareness, right? But it's hanging there in the aura anyway.
Right.
And so oftentimes the thing that looks like an entity is nothing more than your own conjuring of your issue, you know.
Like a thought form that we in
It's like a thought
Spiritism.
form. It's like a thought form. No. Now, that doesn't mean that that there haven't been times when very clearly when I'm working with a person that there definitely was influence from another entity.
Right.
You know, and it had to be contended with and dealt with.
Right.
And the simplest way to do that is by empowering that person to declare their own, let's say, identity, or if you will, to declare their space.
Declare their space. Right. To
That's
claim.
theirs.
Right.
Claim their space as theirs,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And once that's done, there's nothing for the entity to hook onto. Okay, so the entity has to go, and so then there's a two-phase process there. So,
Right.
you know, I don't want to leave the entity, abandoned either.
Right.
You know, and basically, you offer them a blessing, and encourage them to go to the light. And there are always spirit helpers there.
Right.
Once they're willing to do that, the spirit helpers just take them off and
Right.
work with them right away.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned the key thing, as they are willing, if they're
Yeah.
willing to be led to the light, the helpers will come right away and rescue them. Awesome.
And I think the most important thing in that piece of the puzzle is having some sense of awareness of what their agenda is. So if you can if you know what their agenda is, you can then tell them in a very supportive way that the way they're going about it will never get them a result.
Right.
You know? And as soon as they reckon with that, then they're open to the next thing.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and one thing that you mentioned to me when we were there in Lily Dale a few years ago that I thought was brilliant. In Spiritism, we have a word called obsession, which is basically the influence of spirits over other spirits, usually between discarnate and incarnates, this word is most frequently used, but it can be between two incarnates, between two discarnates, or between an incarnate to a discarnate, but the word obsession carries this little bit of a stigma, and what you mentioned that I thought was brilliant was that you said I call this interdimensional codependency.
Yes.
And I thought that was brilliant because it puts the onus of responsibility on both sides in a way, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
There's not a victim on one side and an oppressor on the other. We're both in this together, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Without the hook, that person can't influence.
Right.
That spirit can't influence. Yeah.
So what are you seeing nowadays in the spiritualist movement in America as far as things, with COVID and these social distancing? What are some of the movements you're seeing rise up that you feel are really relevant and important for us to mention here, for people to be aware of?
Well, you know what? I honestly think it's way beyond spiritualism. It's way beyond anyone, faith
Sure.
or orientation. And it's this. I think that we are being encouraged to fundamentally change the structures of society.
Right.
You know, and what I love, and this is to me, this is where Davis comes in for me too. It's called the harmonial philosophy, because Davis says ultimately, as all the great ones said, that the ultimate objective on planet Earth is to establish a profound state of harmony with all beings, with all life forms here, and that is the ultimate direction for planet Earth and even our species. So that having been said, this is an extraordinary opportunity for us to face some of the ways in which we have malfunctioned.
Right. Yeah.
And basically that's all it is. It's a malfunction of, and then once we face that and recognize, and I think the biggest thing, and we're starting to see this, has to do with hierarchies and false hierarchies. And including, all these income differentials and all that's a false hierarchy.
Right. Right. For sure.
But but the way in which we have been exposed to the COVID thing, recognizing how important and valuable the people are that we once thought, would look askance at, just walk by. It's like, so the person that handles the checkout at the store is an incredibly valuable person.
Yeah.
And I think that as we understand the complexity of society and begin to appreciate the fact that everything that we do in this world it employs billions of other souls, that in anything that in the modern world, it's like, wow. I'm sitting here, the books that I'm using, probably hundreds of hands went into creating them. Hundreds or thousands of hands went into creating this computer. The chair that I'm sitting in. Oh my God! It was like, think about all of that. If we started to appreciate the impact that our brothers and sisters have made on our lives, it should hopefully change the way in which we organize society so that people are truly appreciated for their contributions.
And you mentioned the word temporary mistakes. It led me to connect with what your definition of grace is, which is to render all mistakes temporary. Is that how it goes?
The power of love that renders all mistakes temporary.
So grace is the power of love that renders all mistakes temporary. I find that so comforting on such a deep level. Phenomenal. It's phenomenal. I want to use that, if you allow me, on my lectures.
Because I'm like Davis. Here's one of the beautiful things about Davis was he didn't take ownership over anything. He said, "This is knowledge that come
freely.
It's meant for everyone." And he did not even think that he was something super special, right?
Nice.
He knew that his gift was unique in many respects, given his time and when it was done. But he didn't think it was special, and he knew that that given the right set of circumstances, a lot of people could achieve that, and he was hoping that he could pass it on to a lot of people.
Definitely.
The capacity to do that. So that's that egalitarian sense. And one of the things that I've been deeply moved by in the last, let's say, 20, 30 years is this holographic perspective on spirituality. Now, do you understand that in a hologram? Well, let me explain. Now, we know what a holograph is, that three-dimensional
projection,
Yeah, three-dimensional projection. Now, what's interesting with the holographic perspective, it comes from the actual film, a holographic film. So the holographic film, if you take a piece from any place on that film and you shine light through it, it gives you the complete image, but not as clear as if you shine it through the whole thing.
Really? Like if you
Yes.
take an entire strip of film,
Right.
but you shine it right here?
Well, you take a piece from any part of that film, and it'll give you the entire image,
Okay.
three-dimensional, but it won't be as defined.
Okay.
Okay, as clearly defined as if you shine it through the whole thing. So what this, to me, is testimony to the fact that at any one place and time, the entire universe reflects itself.
Wow.
That's the holographic perspective. And ever since I could see that, oh, there was evidence of that, clear evidence of that in this physical form, in this holographic film.
Yeah, I think that actually helps to explain the work you do on multi dimensions at the same time. Because if they're
Yeah.
manifesting at the same time, then you can tap them at any one moment, right? And they're
Yeah.
interconnected in a way. Wow.
Absolutely.
Speaking of that, Tom, we want to have you back at some point in the future because what I was mentioning in the beginning of our show is the guided meditations that you do were very powerful, and you have a emphasis on healing for the planet Earth and grounding us along with the planet Earth. And so I wanted to invite you back and let our viewers know in the future that we wanted to experience a guided meditation that you can do spontaneously here on the air. And I think it could be super beneficial now that people have gotten familiar a little bit with your work. And I wish there's more time for us to talk more about your work, Lily Dale, Andrew Jackson Davis, and so many others. But that'll be really cool because I think this would be the first time that we attempt in this format around the fire a guided meditation. So,
Oh, I would be more than happy to do it. By the way, I consider it a blessing to do these kinds of meditations because I can feel people joining in. You can feel when people connect energetically with something
Nice.
you're doing, and it's beautiful. And back in the 80s, one of the things, and I did mention this earlier, that when I was traveling around the country with this metaphysical group and doing some of their teachings, I was also doing some of my own, and I was inspired to set up planetary consciousness groups.
planetary consciousness groups.
Yes, and the objective of those groups was to connect to the soul of the planet and to work harmoniously with the soul of the planet to bring about positive change, and to also understand that that when a group comes together and focuses simultaneously on the same thing, not just coming together and all meditating together,
Right.
but meditating with the same focus, everything gets multiplied many times more than if
Much
they were
more
just
powerful.
there meditating in the same room, because they
But,
were
yeah.
also they're focusing on the same thing at the same time. And so I learned a lot in running those groups, and people found them very valuable because there was probably 10 or 12 cities in the country that had groups that got established, and they stayed together until we have such an active modern life. People move from one place to another.
Right.
Somebody gets married, this and that. So that's the only thing that caused the groups to fall apart. But
Well, now with Zoom and YouTube and Facebook,
Yeah.
no matter where they are, we can just set a date and time, go on the
Yeah.
air, and the group will form itself around the fire with your
Sure.
guidance. I look forward to that, Tom. Listen, I want to thank you so much for your time. Big hug again here to all your loved ones. Stay safe, stay healthy. And I wanted to invite everyone to stay tuned to our YouTube channel, Spirit Reflections, so you can get the notification about the next time we're going to have Tom back for this guided meditation. And I always like to end our broadcast, Tom, with a song that I get from 1969, actually. So around the time that you were there in college discovering metaphysics and spirituality. I think this song speaks so much about me. I mean, the power of music just goes without saying, right? But especially around that time that the world was going through so many upheavals in the U.S. and other parts too. The lyrics are from the song "The Age of Aquarius" by the group Fifth Dimension. And what the part I show here is that mantra that they say over and over: "Let the sun shine in." Let the sun shine in. So we want to close our broadcast always around the fire, hoping that people have warmed up their hearts, enlightened their minds with the conversations around the fire, but that they leave wherever they do, where they disconnect, thinking about this notion, letting the sun shine in, so we can stay strong together.
And I want to thank you and your audience for this opportunity.
Awesome, Tom. A pleasure. Friends, we will see you in the next episode of Around the Fire here in Spirit Reflection. Thank you so much. Have a good night.